everybody can see it. And with that, I'm just delighted to introduce our guest today, Seth Klein. So as you all know, Seth is the author of a fantastic book everyone seems to be talking about called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for a Climate Emergency. And as we'll hear today, this book is structured around lessons from World War II, the last time that Canada faced an existential threat. And while others have said that we need a wartime approach to address the climate crisis, A Good War is the first book that really lays out what that might actually look like, as we'll dig in today. So Seth has been an activist, a writer, a researcher, a policy expert for many decades. And before writing A Good War, he ran the BC Centre for Policy Alternatives for over 20 years, a public policy institute devoted to environmental, economic, and social justice. And I personally consider Seth a mentor and a great leader. So it's an honor to have you, Seth. And moderating the conversation, Barnabe Geis, our Director of Programs at the Center for Social Innovation. Barnabe's been with CSI for about 10 years and designs and runs a range of programs and supports that support entrepreneurs and startups and all of our members. He founded Climate Ventures at CSI, as well as this event series, and we work very closely together. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to you, Barnabe.
Thank you, Shay, and welcome, and thank you to our audience for joining us. I'm really excited to have you as a guest, Seth, as I learned so much from your book. It really provides us with quite the blueprint for how we can transform our economy to the next economy, which, as Shay described, is basically the clean and just economy that we strive for. And I was, of course, familiar with the war response analogy, but I have to say it was usually in the form of a reference to the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. And in your book, you really look at the war effort itself and what it has to teach Canada today. And what I discovered is that there's a lot it can teach us. But before we jump right in, I just wanted to ask you where you're joining us from today, Seth.
Hi, Barnabe, and thanks to you and Shay for this invite. I am on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, otherwise known as Vancouver.
Awesome. And so diving right in, this is your first book. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to this point and why you decided to write this book now?
Yeah, it is indeed my first book. I spent 22 years at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, writing policy papers, which is a different enterprise. And I left the CCPA a little over 2 years ago, wanting to focus more on the climate emergency, feeling increasingly alarmed and anxious, like a lot of people with us today, I'm sure. And in particular, you know, when you work at the CCPA, you spend a lot of time in this space between the public policy solutions you're convinced need to happen and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And no more so when it comes to climate, where there is this harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politicians seem prepared to do. And so I wanted to tackle that gap. The opening premise that I was working with was that what we're doing isn't working. You know, the book starts off with this chart. You know, I am still, you know, I was with the CCPA, so there's going to be a chart. And the chart is just Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back 20 years. And it's basically just a flat line. So after all the talk, all the commitments, all the pledges, we have not bent the curve. All we have done is flatline our emissions. And if we don't do something dramatic about that, we're in big trouble. So that was the premise. But I should say, you know, as Shay said off the top, the book is all structured around lessons from the Second World War. It did not start off that way. Initially, in my initial book outline, there was going to be a single chapter on that subject, because I had long been intrigued by World War II as this example of rapid economic transformation. But then as I delved into the research, I started to see more and more parallels. And additionally, I was talking to other friends who were, unlike me, authors of books. And they kept saying, you know, the key difference from a policy paper is that there's got to be narrative, there's got to be story. And of course, the World War II story has tons of narrative and story in it. And so I rewrote the whole plan and ended up structuring, as you now know, the whole book around that framework.
Well, I think it worked well, because there's a very compelling cast of characters that pulled me in. So in broad strokes, what did our World War II mobilization entail? And what were the big lessons that you think apply to today's climate crisis?
Well, first of all, just in terms of the scale of the mobilization, it was extraordinary. I mean, so just to offer a few stats on that, Canada was a population of about 11 million people at the time. And from that total population, over 1 million people enlisted. I mean, that is that is extraordinary, isn't it? In terms of a level of buy-in and contribution. And then more than 1 million were directly involved in military production. So a huge, I mean, this was an all-consuming effort. And for those who were involved in military production, and that's one of the central focus areas of the book, what they did, what the Canadian labor force and economy produced, and the speed and scale in which they produced it was jaw-dropping. So from a base of virtually nothing, there was almost nothing in the way of military production in Canada before the war. We produced about 700 ships, 16,000 military aircrafts, and ultimately produced the 4th largest air force in the world at the time. 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, all from a base of virtually nothing. So I think there's a ton of lessons to be learned from how the speed, and consider that not only when we think about the economic transformation, we actually did it twice, right? There was the whole ramp up of military production and then the reconversion to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. So for all of us who stress and worry, you know, can we really do what we need to do in time? The answer is yeah, because we did. And, you know, I've been asked many times around those key lessons for the present. And I've done my best to distill, and I'll throw it in the chat, maybe this, I have this one article where I try to distill the 400-page book into 4 lessons. And I'll circle back to them, and I'm sure in the course of the conversation, but off the top, those key lessons are: you spend what it takes to win. You create new economic institutions to get the job done. You move from voluntary and incentive-based approaches to mandatory measures as required. And you tell the truth. You tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and what we have to do. And Canada did all of those things in the war. I would actually say our federal government has done all of those things with respect to the pandemic. And with respect to the climate emergency, neither our federal government or any provincial government, in fact, it's not that they don't hit all of them. They don't hit any of them.
And a point you make in the book too is that we had to transform it, as you say, to a war mobilization and then back to a post-war economy, whereas here we're talking about one transformation, not two.
Exactly. Oh, and there's one other key lesson really at the heart of the book. The book spends a lot of, you know, there's a lot of climate purists out there, policy purists, who say, don't link what we have to do with climate to all of these other social justice issues and equality. Like, don't make it any more complicated. It's hard enough as it is. And I respectfully disagree, because I think, so the book explores the connections between inequality and climate. But the main reason I'm doing that, despite the obvious connections, is because that's how we win. And that is a key lesson out of the Second World War. The way we actually achieve mass mobilization in the war wasn't just telling people to go across the ocean to fight some distant tyrant. The way we mobilized everyone is by making a pledge to them that the society they came back to at the end of it was going to look different.
Yeah,
that's how you get everyone on the bus.
Yeah, when I read your book, there was one thing that kind of always gnawing at me, which was, you write that Canada was reluctant and unprepared to go to war, and how at the outbreak of the war, its commitment was limited. Of course, we know the United States only joined the war effort after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So do you believe that we can see the kind of mobilization you describe in your book and of the scale we saw in World War II without some sort of climate equivalent of Nazis storming across Europe or the bombing of Pearl Harbor? Do we need a or several defining, devastating moments, even greater than what we've already witnessed, to kind of galvanize us into action of this magnitude? And I guess asked another way is, how far away do you think we are from being able to marshal such a significant response?
Well, I would say it's already happening, first of all. And it's been happening over the last 3 years, that in particular, extreme weather events are shifting the zeitgeist. And in the polling that I commissioned from Abacus that I share in the book, I think you capture that shift in the terrain where the sense of climate emergency has moved from sometime in the future somewhere else to here and now. People say they are experiencing it. And I'm saying, let's call these extreme weather events what they are. They're attacks on our soil, to put it back in those militaristic terms. But to bring this back to the war story, see, I actually take some solace from your opening point there, because a lot of us, in the rearview mirror, we assume that Canada declared war in September of 1939 and everyone was ready to rally, and that's not true. Or similarly, when I was telling people about the premise of the book as I was writing it, people would often say, "Oh yeah, but back then everyone understood the threat; it was clear and present." Well, you know what? They didn't. That's not true. If you were in Europe, the threat was clear and present. If you were a Canadian, it was on the other side of 2 oceans. And yet we threw ourselves into it regardless. It took a little time, right? The first 9 months of the war, historians refer to as the phony war. We declared war, but not really. I feel like that's what we're in now. We're in the phony war period of the climate fight, where we declare, our federal government declares climate emergency one day and reapproves the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion the next day. But like in the war, that's going to change. And how those things change are a combination of events, like extreme weather events, as you say, but also leadership. It takes leadership to move the public and to shift the zeitgeist. And we've all had a taste of that now in the pandemic, right? Like, we can all think about because we all spend the early period of any crisis in a period of denial, right? And we can all remember when we first started to hear about the first cases of COVID, but it seemed far away and it wasn't really going to change our lives. And we can all remember which events start to shift that, right? For a lot of people, it's the cancellation of the NBA season. I remember that. I don't even watch basketball, and I remember that. And I remember thinking, "Ooh, that's weird." But I also know it took seeing the prime minister in front of his house every morning to shift the zeitgeist. And so it's events and it's leadership together that's this alchemy. And you mentioned the change in the US too, in Pearl Harbor, but that brings up the importance of the role of the media as well, because the US saw this extraordinary 20 percentage point shift in US public opinion about entry into the war before Pearl Harbor. And really, a lot of people credit the team at CBS News and Edward R. Murrow for bringing about a lot of that, because they knew what side of history they wanted to be on. And they were actually having a conversation with the public about what this moment called for. And there are lessons from the war around the role of the Wartime Information Board. I'd love to see a climate wartime information board, and the role of advertising, which was ubiquitous in the war, but really pretty invisible in the present. Not only is it invisible, but I think we should be banning fossil fuel car advertising, because it's confusing. So yeah, I'll leave it at that in terms of the public opinion.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit more. You had your 4 points about what this mobilization could look like today. Something that came up several times in your book was around the role of crown corporations during World War II and what that could look like today as one example. So I thought that was fascinating. So if you could talk more about what it would look like now, that I think that would help.
Yeah. All right. Let's double back to those 4 markers. So the first one is spend what it takes to win, and I would say the Trudeau government isn't spending a little less than it should be on climate. It's spending less by a massive order of magnitude, probably a 10-fold order of magnitude, if we were to be spending about at the levels that we should, specifically on climate. But why the marker 2 is around creating new economic institutions. And as you say, I spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about the fact that in the war, so we created 28 crown corporations during the war. This was all done by C.D. Howe, by the way. And there's, of course, for those of you in Toronto, this, or most of us who know his name today know it because there is a neoliberal think tank named for the guy. And yet during the war, this guy, let's be clear, he was no lefty. He was definitely, he's a private business guy, but he wasn't ideological. And in the war, he basically became the Minister for State Economic Planning. And he's seized with the task of military production. So he's the minister who oversees all of Canada's military production. And he's happy to give contracts to the private sector. But if they couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he creates another crown corporation to get the job done. He's not only doing that, he's carefully planning and managing the economy. So for all the key supply chains for the military production effort, rubber, coal, fuel, timber, machine tools, you name it, he's got controllers who are coordinating all of these supply chains in order to privilege and prioritize military production. And he's taken a whole inventory of what do we need to produce and what's our capacity and how do we create that capacity if it's missing. I mean, that is so different from what we're doing today, right? The Trudeau government, by the way, has created two crown corporations, the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. So what would those look like today? In the book, I have a sort of 3-page list of what would the new generation of public corporations be to mass produce and deploy all of what we need to electrify everything. So how many electric buses, how many wind turbines, solar panels, heat pumps, etc. And like we've wrestled with the pandemic on the question of emergency supplies and vaccines. In fact, the vaccine one is an interesting one, right? We're all living with this right now. Why do I fixate on crown corporations? Because in the absence of crown corporations, the best we can do is try to incentivize somebody else to produce what we need instead of doing it ourselves. Now, we've really just learned that lesson in a big time way when it comes to the vaccine.
Right.
But the third marker is also really important. When I say, as I did off the top, that our emissions have basically just flatlined, why is that? And I think a big piece of that is, if you survey all of our federal and provincial climate policies to date, they're all voluntary. We incentivize change, we encourage change, we give rebates, we send price signals. That's not what you do in an emergency. In an emergency, you require change. And yet we haven't done that. So I think we need mandatory measures, again, like we've done in the pandemic. But in this case, it would be saying, for example, you will not be able to buy a fossil fuel vehicle as of 2025. No new buildings will be able to tie into natural gas for space and water heating as of next year. That's how you would signal to the public that this is the real deal.
It's probably a great place to ask you who and what is blocking such a mobilization, and when do you think we'll know that the government actually gets it, that we're in emergency mode?
Yeah. Well, the book identifies the main barrier as something that I call the new climate denialism. So this is just different from the straight up climate denialism, which, for what it's worth, I think represents a diminishing rump of public opinion and is not actually our main barrier to change. I think our bigger barrier to change, what I mean by the new climate denialism, are those leaders, federally, provincially, well, at every level, within industry, who say that they get it, who say they accept the science on climate change, but continue to practice a policy agenda that does not align with what the science says we have to do. Now, why do we all, so many of us and so many of our leaders, fall prey to that? So one is, the curse of climate compared to the war and the pandemic is that it moves in slow motion, and that lets leaders kick the issue the can down the road. The second is that, I interviewed many politicians for the book, and I wasn't interested in interviewing politicians who were straight up climate deniers. I was only interested in interviewing politicians who, like I say, I think, truly get it. And yet their governments or parties are practicing the new climate denialism. And almost every one of them fell back on some variant of the line, well, you've got to meet the public where they're at, and the public's not there. Which is why I undertook this poll with Abacus. I wanted to test if that was true. And what I found is that those politicians really have a false view of public readiness and don't give the public enough credit. Another barrier is simply the fossil fuel industry itself and everything they have done to block progress, but also a political class that, you know, to put this in Chamberlain versus Churchill frame, they are seeking to appease the industry. Yeah. And you see it even in our climate plans, right? As our federal and provincial governments create these advisory bodies, and then they put fossil fuel reps on those advisory bodies. And what I'm saying is at this late hour, to have a climate plan that with which those industry reps can find comfort is not going to be a climate plan worth having. And the final thing, I'm sorry, I'm giving you a long-winded answer on this one, but I think this one's really important in terms of why we haven't seen progress, is that so many of us and so many of our leaders are caught in a straitjacket of neoliberal thinking and ideas and assumptions, because they have been the dominant ideology for 40 years now, and they limit how. So why isn't the federal government spending what it should spend? Why aren't they creating new crown corporations? Why aren't they using the regulatory power of the state to just require change? And the answer is because those neoliberal assumptions tell them what is and isn't allowed, and we need to bust out of it.
Yeah, 100%. So let's talk about the private sector then. You quote Liberal Cabinet Minister C.D. Howe, which I learned through your book was nicknamed, he was nicknamed the Minister of Everything during World War II, who said, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." And so, you know, to that previous question, kind of about the climate Pearl Harbor, we can imagine it might take quite a lot for the private sector to view the climate crisis with that same level of existential importance. Can you tell us a bit about the leadership from the business community during World War II and what you think we would need to see that kind of leadership again?
Mm-hmm. Well, so this is the thing about an emergency mindset once it actually takes root, is that it busts open the real rule book. And so the quote you have from C.D. Howe is, when he was pressed about the level of government spending, which was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, his response was, if we lose the war, nothing will matter. And then if we win the war, no one will care. And that's sort of the ethos I think we need today. So you're asking about the role of the private sector. It was important and significant in the war. So first of all, the private sector itself pivoted and was deeply engaged in this military production. But again, I would caution, it wasn't out of their own goodwill. It was because they were ordered to do so. Just to give an American example, just to think about the speed with which this is possible. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 41. In February of 42, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit, 2 months later. Now that didn't happen because the leadership of the big three did it, you know, out of patriotism and so on. It happened because they were ordered to do it. But there was also incredible buy-in from the private sector. So they were engaged in military production. Of course, thousands of them enlisted. And thousands of them were involved in the promotion and sale of victory bonds. And amazingly, they also were prepared to accept this incredible change to the taxation system in order to pay for a big chunk of this. Mm-hmm. So the corporate income tax rate in the war went from 18 to 40%. And on top of that, they brought in an excess profits tax. And the way that worked is that they went back to the 4 years before the war, Depression years, 36 to 39. They looked at the average rate of profit. And then they went to every business, large and small, in the land and said, guess what? That's your annual limit until the war is over. So once you hit that, your marginal tax rate was 100%. And icons of business in that era gave speeches to their fellow business leaders telling them that they had to accept this. So the kind of profiteering we've seen in the pandemic, by the way, was illegal in the Second World
Right.
War. And then finally, over 100 of the leading business, they were all men at the time in the war, became seedy house $1 a year men. So they basically, well, what did they do? They abandoned their private sector posts and became the leaders of these crown corporations and served as the controllers of these supply chains, and many of them for many, many years during the war. And so that's where, I mean, when I talk to business people today who are concerned about climate, and some of whom are doing some extraordinary stuff, right? The clean tech sector is, and there's just all kinds of fantastic innovations, and you folks work with a lot of these people, which is to be lauded, and we're going to be able to do this thanks to a bunch of the stuff these people have created. But let's acknowledge, right now, it's a side hustle.
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about the speed and scale of what we have to accomplish in the next 10 years, what's significant about the leaders from the Second World War, the private sector leaders, these icons of their time, is that they were disabusing their fellow business leaders from any notion that you could achieve that speed and scale any way other than state-led. And if we're going to move from side hustle to full scale, it's going to have to be that way again. And we need private sector leaders who are ready to say that.
Yeah, and I found the story of the $1 a year men really inspiring, because that was a great part of the book. We've talked about the role of government, the role of business. So let's talk about individual households. Obviously, in the climate movement, households and individuals tend to be kind of the scapegoat, or we're told that we should do this or do that, when that's obviously not going to get us to where we need to go. But can you tell us about the role of individual households during the war, and what it might look like in the climate mobilization? There's a part in your book where you mention, or a few parts where you talk about carbon quotas on households. And while that proposal entirely makes sense to me, there was definitely a part of me that thought, well, people are never going to go for this. They're going to call this, fascism or something.
Right. Well, true mobilization, in a true mobilization like we had in World War II, everyone has to do their bit, and it becomes an all of society effort, and it certainly was in the Second World War. Although it's never unanimous, eh? There's always people who, just like in the pandemic, there's the anti-social people who don't listen and don't go along. And I don't think we should wring our hands too much about that, because it doesn't have to be unanimous. But for the vast majority of the public, people were all in. So not only were they enlisting in extraordinary numbers, but at the household level, people were growing victory gardens, people were recycling everything, people were lowering their heat, they were carpooling, they were changing their mode of transportation in different ways. It's ironic that many of the things they were told to do were kind of precursors to what we now say people should do for environmental reasons, but conserve energy, conserve fuel, grow locally, recycle everything.
Right.
But even if it wasn't done for that reason. But this is why I also say it's important, marker number 3 around making things mandatory. I think, there's much of the public that wants to do what we have to do. But in some ways, we're all caught in a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, right? Like we want to do it, but we're like, what's the point if I do it if my neighbor isn't doing it? Which isn't illogical. And the nice thing about a mandatory measure is you don't have to worry about your neighbor. your neighbor's going to do it because they have no choice. And then everyone, and again, you see echoes of that in the pandemic, right? Where in some ways, much of the public is asking our politicians to make things mandatory so they don't feel like they're being a chump doing what they're told to do.
Right.
You see what I mean? The quotas are the kind of most extreme level of that mandatory measure. And so in the war, we had household quotas for all these key household necessities. I don't think we're going to need it at that kind of micro level in the climate emergency, but there's certainly those out there who've recommended a kind of carbon quota system, which would still leave people some choice about how they wanted to use their diminishing carbon quota. For me, that measure is one to kind of keep in the back pocket. We need to dramatically lower our emissions over the next 10 years. And if we get to 2025 and we're not on target, I think we're going to need to consider something like that.
Right. Before the pandemic, there's the Green New Deal, especially in the United States, had a kind of a big moment in the spotlight. And of course, a lot of the opposition focused on the huge bill, the amount of money that it would cost for something of this scale. Then the pandemic came around, and we realized, oh, when there's an emergency, governments do a pretty good job of finding huge sums of money. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that played out in World War II and what some of the funding mechanisms from World War II could look like today.
Yeah, and then there's this wonderful quote from Tommy Douglas from a speech he gave when he retired from politics in '71. Where because he had been a young MP before becoming Saskatchewan Premier at the beginning of the war and in the Depression. And he recounts this story about how at the peak of the Depression, he was calling for the government to spend money to help the unemployed. And the Liberal finance minister of the day saying, oh, the honorable member thinks there's some magic money tree. Where's the money going to come from? And Tommy Douglas was like, well, I don't know exactly, but I know if there was a war, you would find it. And so they did.
Yeah.
And so they did. I mean, federal government spending increased tenfold during the war. Mm-hmm. Appreciate for a moment that my book was written before the pandemic, right? I sent it off and then I quickly wrote an epilogue about the pandemic. But the pandemic drives home many of the points that I'm trying to make, particularly on this front. So just to throw some numbers out there, this year in the pandemic, Canada's debt to GDP ratio is going to increase from a little above 30% to about 50%. Now that's a big jump in a single year, no question. But at the end of World War II, it was more than double that. Like all the spending we've done in the pandemic still doesn't hold a candle to what we did in the Second World War. And that accumulation of debt in the Second World War didn't, spell economic ruin. It actually was it presaged a 30-year period of the strongest economic performance we've ever known. And there's something to be learned from that as well. But the most incredible thing out of the pandemic is how we have financed that. And this is, I think, one of the great underreported stories of the pandemic. Right from the beginning of the lockdown in March, the Bank of Canada has been buying federal government securities to the tune of $5 billion a week. Now, just recently, in recent weeks, they've lowered that to $4 billion a week. Still incredible. So almost all that increase in debt from 30% to 50% of GDP is now held by all of us, by the Bank of Canada, meaning not only are the interest rates incredibly low, but any interest we pay on it, we pay back to ourselves. It's a crown corporation. Mm-hmm. And look at the contrast, right? The federal government is spending now about maybe 5 to 7 billion, depending on what you include, a year on climate action. 5 to 7 billion a year compared to 5 billion a week. So for me, what we've seen in terms of the federal fiscal response in the pandemic, and in particular, this remarkable role by the Bank of Canada, it just lays bare what was possible all along in response to homelessness and poverty and climate, if and when we decide to see these things as the emergencies that they are.
Can you tell us a little bit about, and I hope I'm getting the name right, but victory bonds? And you've done some research actually around what climate bonds, what the appetite for the public would be for climate bonds.
Yeah, research might be overstating it. It was some polling, but so during the war, about half of that increase in spending was financed by increases in taxes. So this ramp up in progressive income taxes and corporate taxes that I alluded to. And the other half was debt financed through the sale of public bonds, which they dubbed victory bonds. And, you know, the sale of the bonds was ubiquitous. And in the States, they did the same thing, and they had Hollywood stars selling them, and people went door to door. I mean, this became a vehicle. It became a piece of how we mobilized and rallied the public, and that everyone could play their part. You know, and it's hard to imagine rallying the public around carbon pricing in quite the same way. So that was about half the financing. So when I say that there was that increase in debt, about half of it was in the form of these victory bonds. So I think that that we should, as part of financing the climate mobilization, we should again sell bonds, particularly for capital expenditures, as opposed to operating expenditures. And a lot of what we need to do for climate is indeed a capital expenditure, right? Building retrofits, high-speed rail, renewable energy things. These are capital expenditures, not operating expenditures. And I did have a polling question that asked, you know, if a government sold green victory bonds, would you consider purchasing them? And there was quite a high level of interest without any advertising program.
Right.
So, I mean, I was just putting that out there to say, if and when a government ever decided that they wanted to make do this as a real thing, particularly in an era when so many people are feeling economic uncertainty and looking for a safe harbor in terms of their investments, this could be just the thing. And there's more to it than that. I mentioned before the federal government, you know, spending some billions a year on climate infrastructure. They're going the route of doing most of that through the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is this public-private partnership vehicle. It's making the financing super complicated. It slows everything down. It just makes it a legal mess compared to the Bank of Canada's role in the pandemic, which is they're just printing the money and doing it. It's so much simpler. And so all of these things where we turn, I feel like sometimes in the private sector, we make this so much more complicated than it needs to be in terms of all these clever financing schemes, when we could just invite the public to buy victory bonds and just do the damn thing.
Yeah, sign me up. We've got about 5 minutes left, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So make sure you add your questions to the Q&A, and Shay will go through them. You touched a little bit on social solidarity. So I wanted to ask, and you're careful in your book also to not overstate it, but you write how there's a certain level of social solidarity that was secured across class, race, and gender during our World War II mobilization. And you also talk in your book about the experience and supports provided to returning soldiers, and what that could teach us about a just transition. So wondering if you could share a bit more about those two things.
Yeah, great. Thanks for asking that. So first of all, I said earlier around the connections to inequality. When it comes to mobilizing the public, you know, in the early propaganda in the war, you know, it was kind of these simplistic propaganda, you know, go get Hitler. And that works to a point, but only to a point. A key turning point in 41 came when the government realized they needed to take a more sophisticated approach. And in particular, they started to engage people in a conversation about the society they were going to return to. And we saw Canada's first major income transfer programs in the war. So unemployment insurance comes in 1940. The family allowance comes in 1944. The Marsh Report, which was this historic commission that lays the architecture for the whole post-war welfare system, and the creation of Medicare and, you know, parental leave and all of this stuff, is written during the war and is offered back to Canadians in throne speeches as a pledge and a promise that they will come back to a different country than the one they were leaving behind. And all of these social relations change in the war, right? Not, as you say, I'm careful not to overstate it. You know, the post-war society remained, of course, you know, deeply patriarchal and racist. And yet those relations changed in profound ways during the war. That's how you got the mobilization. That's how you got the recruitment numbers. And in fact, when I mentioned earlier that they brought in an excess profits tax, part of why they did that was in the First World War, there had been rampant and grotesque profiteering. And that had undermined social solidarity and undermined recruitment efforts. And the Mackenzie King government was very cognizant of that. And so that's why they bring in the excess profits tax as part of communicating to the public, this time, everyone's in and no one gets to get rich on this. But then you also raised the point about the lessons around how we handled the return of soldiers. And this is a really important lesson too, that I call it, leave no one behind as a key lesson. So there's somewhere around 200,000 Canadians today who are directly employed in the production of fossil fuels. That's a lot, of course. We need to deal with that. But just to put that in perspective, as I said, in the war, from a population less than a third what it is today, 1 million people enlisted and over 1 million were involved in military production, far, far more than are employed in fossil fuel industries today. All those people had to be recruited, trained up, and then reintegrated into a peacetime economy. And the government created these audacious programs to do that, on income support programs, housing support programs, post-secondary training and apprenticeship programs that completely transformed the face of the post-secondary sector in Canada for a generation and changed the lives of thousands of people. And if we could do that then, I believe we could do that again. And so when I mentioned earlier, like we need new economic institutions, I talked primarily about crown corporations, but let me put out there another one. I think we need a new federal transfer program, a climate emergency just transition program, big and audacious, $20 to $40 billion a year for the next 10 years. But unlike most federal transfers, which divvy the money up by population, let's divvy this one up by GHG emissions. So if Alberta produces about 40% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, we'll freeze that in time. And for the next 10 years, they get 40% of the money, recognizing that places like Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland have a heavier lifting job to do over the next 10 years as we decarbonize our society. But here's the catch. I don't think we should send that money to Jason Kenney or Scott Moe because they're not to be trusted. I think we should create new just transition agencies in each province, jointly governed by all levels of government and Indigenous nations in those provinces, and with workers and business reps and climate experts, so we can ensure that the money is being spent on actual climate transition programs and retraining. But here's the thing, unlike the hollow promise of just transition that most workers have known, people will be able to see billions of dollars on the table, and the jobs, and frankly, more stable jobs than what people in the oil industry have been experiencing. I think that's an important piece of how we not only speak to people's economic insecurity in this moment, but also navigate the quagmire of Canadian Confederation at this moment.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I'll ask my last question and then pass it to Shay. I'll end with a question around leadership. Obviously, your book is filled with incredible examples of leadership during our World War II mobilization. And as we've discussed, that leadership is not yet there in some key places here in Canada. And just wondering what kind of leadership we need and where do you think we may find it?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think I wrote the book with with progressive political leaders in mind as a sort of first level audience, and as an invitation to them to think about the leaders who saw us through the existential crisis of World War II, and to think a little deeper about who they want to be at this moment. And that's, by the way, one of the things that's been fun as I've been touring with the book since September. It's remarkable to me how resonant this story remains 80 years later. And so many political leaders and other leaders and business leaders, labor leaders, leaders in the farming sector, in journalism. You know, there are people from that story who are important to them. So the first lesson, or the first leadership thing I would say, is that marker number 4, about telling the truth. The leaders we most remember from the Second World War were forthright with the public about the severity of the crisis and what we had to do. But they were remarkable because they were able to be forthright about the severity of the risk and yet still impart hope, right? That's a true leadership test. But you have to accept the truth. And you know, my sense is that with a lot of leaders, you watch and listen to them, and for all of us who look at the science of climate change, you either get it in your gut or you don't, and you can tell when someone gets it or not. I think there's a bit of, in the book, there's a bit of a Where's Waldo thing running through it. I don't know if you noticed, Barnabe, but I call it spot the rule breaker. A lot of the leaders we particularly note out of that World War II story were people who threw out the rule book or defied orders to do what was required in an emergency. And so those are leaders we remember too.
Right.
And I do think there are those people out there. I tried to name some of them in the book. There are political leaders who are climate champions, who are prepared to throw out the rule book, who, like our World War II leaders, don't want to meet the public where they're at. They want to take the public where they need to go. And I guess I would say this, to make this final point before we open to other questions. A lot of us despair about whether or not these leaders we have can do what's needed. And maybe they can't, but I would note this. If you asked Canadians in 1938, this gang of Mackenzie King's government, do they have what it takes to completely transform Canadian society and the economy? I'm pretty sure most Canadians would have said, no, not this gang. And if you had asked me 12 months ago, if there were people in Finance Canada or the Bank of Canada who could pivot as quickly as we've seen and create these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy, I hate to say it, but I would have told you, no, I don't think there's anyone home who thinks that way. And I would have been wrong. So you never know.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi,
Okay,
Shay.
I'm overwhelmed by all the questions. I'm trying my best here. So first one, I think building off of what you were just touching on, Seth, around leadership, but there's a bunch of questions where it's like, I think Donna Marie put it most directly, like, well, how do we get our leaders to lead? I think this is around strategy. So what's the best strategy, do you think, to move Canada to mobilization? So some ideas were popping up in the chat and in questions. So like, ask them to be bold, apply pressure through lobbying, mass civil disobedience, advocating for a Green New Deal. Curious for your thoughts on that.
Yes to all of those things. I mean, the pressure to truly throw out the rule book and do what needs to be done is always going to happen initially from the outside. So there is an important role for civil society in those protests, including civil disobedience, as your questioner said. I'm hard pressed to think of a key social movement change that didn't involve some manner of civil disobedience, peaceful civil disobedience. I think, but it's also about direct political engagement and pressuring these people, making them uncomfortable if they are not practicing the 4 markers, and electing more climate champions. Like we need bigger squads, to use that term. People refer to around AOC and her colleagues in Congress in the States, at provincially and federally and in numerous parties. We need squads of climate champions who are in it to win it. And so that's a key piece of it as well. And like I say, those people are out there, and they work together, these two, inside and outside. Like, I like to tell the story. I'm very biased in this story. But well, Shay, as you know, my wife is a Vancouver City Councillor, Christine Boyle, who moved the climate emergency motion in Vancouver. So the first in English Canada back almost a couple of years ago. And Vancouver has a true climate emergency plan now. one of the most ambitious in North America. All new buildings in Vancouver won't be able to use natural gas for space and water heating as of next year, right? That's what I'm talking about. And the Vancouver political story is an interesting one. So the council Chris was elected to, no party has a majority. You never know how this gang's going to vote. They're all over the political map. And yet those climate emergency motions passed unanimously. Why is that? And so the climate isn't a political wedge issue in Vancouver the way it is in so many of our provinces and federally. So why is that? So part of it is that Chris is really good at her job and she's in it to win it. And she didn't do any polling on this stuff because she didn't really care. She just thought it had to be done. But she would say that part of why it's unanimous is because each time these votes came up, dozens of high school students skipped school, they rallied outside, they spoke before council, they filled the galleries, they watched the votes, and they basically made it politically impossible even for the more conservative councillors to vote no. So we need to do that across the country.
Hear, hear. More specifically, I think what Josh is getting at, a question around, can Seth elaborate on what's the mechanism for the federal government to create bonds that are paid back to itself? So I think around the conversation around debt and spending. Can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, the idea of green victory bonds is just a branding thing. My point is that they're already doing it. That's what they've been doing since March. I mean, almost all of the debt we have taken on federally is money created by the Bank of Canada. Simply by making money appear and buying those government securities. And this is why so much of the spending that's needed, whether it's provincial or federal, municipal or provincial, needs to come from the feds. The feds have a financial capacity because of the Bank of Canada and monetary policy to do what other levels of government cannot. And so the onus is on them to mass fund a lot of what needs to happen.
Next one, I'll try to fold two. It's a double barrel. So what do you think we as a society have to sacrifice, if anything, to achieve this vision? And then relatedly from Eva, how do we continue to put emphasis on people and small and medium-sized businesses to lead in this transition? How would you see this being enforced with climate change policies?
Well, in the second of those, I guess a big part of what I'm saying in the book is that too much of the conversation about climate for the last few decades has been individualized. We talk about them in terms of what needs to happen, what we're individually supposed to do, or our own small business or whatever. This is a political project, right? That is the point about the war. Both the war and the climate fight are inherently collective enterprises that need to be state-led. And if it's not happening, make it happen through political engagement. On the sacrifice, I mean, first of all, let's appreciate for a moment that no one is asking anyone today to sacrifice anything like what we did in the war. In terms of the sacrifice of lives and money and foregoing different things. And yet it's interesting to note that those who did live through that period often remember it, despite all of that sacrifice, as one of the best times of their lives, because they were engaged in a collective enterprise and had a sense of purpose and meaning. There are sacrifices. We are going to have to change certain things we're accustomed to, particularly around travel. That's probably the biggest. Like air travel in particular, that remains the hardest thing in terms of changing. You know, some of us are going to have to pay more in taxes, and some of us are going to have to spend more out of pocket to electrify our homes and how we get around. But the flip side is equally, if not more true. What emerges from this is a better life in terms of our connection to community and what our communities look like, and really a rebalancing, right? That this is the great appeal to me of the Green New Deal, is it's saying all of these the pressures you feel to make so much money in order to pay for your kids' childcare and your parents' elder care and your kids' post-secondary education, chill out, man. We're going to do those things together. That's what I mean by that rebalancing.
Thanks, Seth. We've only got 1 minute left. I'm sorry, there's so many great questions. I'm not going to be able to get to them. Again, we'll follow up with the recording, with links to resources, and thank you all for being so engaged. Sorry, I can't get to many questions. Seth, I'm just wondering if you have closing thoughts for us, if there's anything that you feel that we missed, or kind of a last message for the crew.
Well, maybe just building on this last point about the fact that what emerges from all of this can look very nice. And a lot of people who follow, all of us on this call who wrestle, who follow the science and read the reports and wrestle with despair, we all do. That's the simple, and rightly so. We don't know. We live in an ambiguous time about whether or not we will do what we need to do. That is the nature of the time in which we're living. But appreciate again, you know, as I said a few times now, out of 11 million people, you know, 1 million people enlisted. What they didn't know is if they would win. We know how the story ended. They did not. And they did what they had to do anyway. And in the course of that, they surprised themselves, not only by what they achieved on the battlefront, but also by what they did on the home front, and not just in terms of military production, but by completely transforming the society that they'd left behind. So I think that's the spirit with which we need to approach these next few years we have to do something bold. And one final thought that relates to sacrifice. Often I've been pressed, like, look at how the fatigue people have in the pandemic, right? They're already fatigued by what they've been asked to do. And that's true, it's real. But there's a key difference. Everything we've been asked to do in this pandemic in the way of sacrifice is anathema to all of our social instincts to isolate. What we are asked to do in the climate emergency is precisely the opposite. We're asked to go out and do something grand together. So that's good.
Fantastic note to end on.
Yeah.
Lots of thank yous rolling in on the chat.
And Shay, if I can just jump in, I just want to plug Seth's book. I highly recommend it. Buy it for yourself or your friends. Avoid Amazon if you can.
Just gave the link. Sorry, I should have done that before.
It is very worthwhile. And thank you, Seth, for your time and this great conversation.
Thanks, guys.
Have a lovely day, all.
Bye, everyone.